Hello, my name is Gerald Seligman, and we're here to talk about the task of creating press kits and bios and cover art and advertisements and how you as a musician go about the very challenging task of communicating who you are and what you do. Because of course your medium is music, but when it comes to a visual representation, when it comes to explaining what it is you do, what makes you unique, in a way we're talking about the need to translate from one medium, music, into another, visual or words. I like to call this storytelling because it's very important to think about focusing on a narrative. As a species, humans love stories. In ancient times, we would sit around the fire and tell one another stories. As children, we love to be read to. We love novels and films and television programs. The whole notion of telling a story about who you are, how you began, where you are, where you hope to go, is a narrative. And it's very important when you're taking your music and communicating it to think in terms of a story, of storytelling and a narrative. So think about how well some people can translate from the one medium to the other. Let's take, for example, hip-hop music. When you think about hip-hop, certain kinds of attitudes and images come to mind. Many people think, it's a tough urban music, it's aggressive, it's very strongly rhythmic. And if you look at this cover here, Mos Def, here's an ideal representation in a visual of what those associations are with the music that we hear. They've translated it, and it's brilliantly done. And the whole narrative of hip-hop, the language, the visual language, the whole visual language of hip-hop is transferred into whoever's doing it. Have a look at this cover from Senegal. Here's a Senegalese hip-hop group, and you can see from the attitude, the clothing, the body language, the same narrative that we think of in North American, African-American hip-hop. We can also see from this cover that this isn't taking place in Queens. From the background you can see it's, in this case, an African setting. But no matter who's doing the hip-hop, here's hip-hop from Malaysia, from Korea, everybody adopts the same attitude. And even idiots who want to appropriate the style will take the same language, in this case, our favorite, Justin Bieber. So it's an act of translation. Think about Moby and his music. I find that this cover is a perfect representation of the kind of urban alienated space that you associate with the music that he creates. Here as well, if you take an artist as unique as Björk, how in visual imagery can you communicate what she does as an artist? And she's one of the most extraordinary artists on so many levels because she thinks about her art, of course, the musical context, but she thinks about dance, costumes, scenes, and she uses technologies in creative ways. So in everything Björk does, she's finding equivalents, she's finding translations from the music into the visual, the website, the apps that she creates. And if you move on to different kinds of music, there's a lot of music that in such ideal ways communicated a sensibility. Think of the Jimi Hendrix Experience in this cover, Are You Experience? It was the album that introduced him to the world. And not only does it have the psychedelic colors and the costumes, the distorted lens, but the typeface that's being used also is something that was very much associated with the counterculture beginning in the mid-60s, the early 60s as it went on. So they found a perfect visual representation for what they were doing musically, and it became, in a sense, a whole package. And you notice also with typeface, very important, very early in the creation of modern popular music, artists interestingly settled on the idea of using logos for their names. If you think of The Who, for example, they always had that same logo with the arrow pointing up. The Beatles on the drum always had the same logo, the same typeface. So already people were thinking about, in advertising you would call it branding, but they were thinking about visual representations of what they do that could help carry forward their message and their narrative. I have here two very interesting covers from music from South Africa. And this was the township music. Correct pronunciation would be Makanga music, pretentious as it may be to say it that way. If you look at this one, this was the famous album, the first compilation that hit North America and Europe, that really introduced this style of music to people outside the tradition, the indestructible beat of Soweto. I love this cover because, like the hip-hop one we were talking about earlier, there's a tremendous amount of attitude here and there's a toughness, but you also see the Soweto street, a dirt street, and you can see the shanty shacks in the background. So in so many ways, this cover found a visual equivalent of not only the music, but the culture it came from. It communicated so much. This second cover is also music from South Africa. Look how completely different this approach is. Here you have two different messages, when neither of them are a correct way to associate the music. What each one is doing is trying to identify a market and send a message about the music. Indestructible Beat of Soweto, it's tough, it's aggressive. The Putumayo, South Africa, is really saying the opposite. It's saying, because it's a cartoon cover, very bright colors, very optimistic, very happy, it's really saying, this is safe, that you will enjoy this. So they had a specific marketing idea and used visual imagery and design to communicate safeness, accessibility, compared to the toughness and the roughness of Indestructible Beat. I like those two beside each other. Manu Chao, as we all know, had made a huge success with this Clandestino album. And Manu Chao is Spanish descent, born and raised in France. Mano Negro was their famous group. But when he went solo, he started experimenting and traveling widely in South America. Andean culture. He was also very interested in the Nueva Trova movement, in the protest movement of the Americas, in the Spanish language Americas. And when it came time to create a cover image for what the music was doing, here they created this one with Clandestino. And in so many ways, this is a successful cover on those same terms about translating from music to imagery and communicating something similar. It looks like graffiti on a wall, and the wall is somewhat decrepit. There are cracks in it, and paint is chipped off. He's standing there, with the attitude and that hat, which came from Andean culture, which became a style, a fad for a while. Clandestino, clandestine. There's something street, obviously street, because he's on a street, and outlaw-like, clandestine. They found a perfect image. So you can see in all of these covers, what we're talking about here, once again, is there's a narrative, there's a story to be told about who the artist is and who, and what the music is. And in the end, this is being translated into the cover. There was an interesting album, it was never very successful, called the Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra. And in this cover, what we've got is musicians standing there wearing long formal jackets like they would in an orchestra. They're playing violins, holding it in a classical way. But of course, they've got dreadlocks as well. So the cover, Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra, you see the reggae, you see the Philharmonic. Very concise, very clean image to communicate. But when we're talking about rules, it's very important to understand that, of course, there's no one right way to do it. What this is a creative process. And what you should be doing is using the same creativity with which you've created the music to create your story and to create your visuals. And sometimes you can communicate by being counterintuitive. If you take this cover of the Beatles, which was their double album, white cover, just the typeface of the Beatles, and each LP was numbered at the time. In a way, this is also sending a message. And it was a modern artist who created the cover for them. But in a way, this is saying, we're so famous, we don't even need to show you who we are at this point. All you need to know is the Beatles, and it's all contained within. And inside the cover, it was very lean design. So they kind of did something counterintuitive, which was creative. And when it comes to types of music as well, different types of music will kind of suggest different styles of visuals. Kind of Blue, the album by Miles Davis, which was a milestone in the creation of new modal jazz, which was a hugely successful album. It's actually the best-selling album, jazz album of all time. And it created a movement. It created a kind of music within jazz that was new at the time. And in this cover, you've got a picture, very dark, of Miles in a suit. I mean, it is the very definition of cool, and this was cool jazz. So I think here's a really successful cover of, once again, finding imagery that suited it. But let's take a look at covers that worked and covers that don't necessarily. Miriam Makeba on the left, one of the greatest artists in the history of African music, one of the most important, not only musically, but also culturally and politically. And here's a cover that really doesn't do anything to match the stature, the meaning of what she's done, of who she was as an individual. It looks like just a cheap press photo kind of thing. Compare it to Rokia Traore on this album, where it's a spectacular cover image. It's so striking. She herself, of course, is very striking. But look what it suggests. If you look at it, you would say, I don't think we have here traditional music necessarily, but I do see that it's African. The design that's stamped around her head, around the photograph, does suggest African textiles and African design. But because of the starkness of the photo, the quality of the photo, it also suggests that this is very modern. You don't look at that and anticipate that you're going to have an album of traditional music here. You have, this cover suggests exactly what the album is, which is deeply based in tradition, but very modern, very contemporary, very unique. Moving on to the idea of this translation, and this is really a discussion for record labels. You notice how a lot of record labels have a certain identifiable look. Take ECM, for example, who are really well known for the quality of their, it's usually a photograph, sometimes just graphic, but largely it's a photographic cover. It always has pretty much the same outfit, the band of white on the top with the text, and then a large photograph within it. Usually in landscape, not portrait. But early on, they were really introducing a kind of music, a kind of approach to European jazz music that was almost like a jazz chamber music. A very refined, open spaces, beautiful recordings. Their covers mirror that in every way. They give you that same impression of the space, of something quite modern. Sometimes the photos, as you can see here, are even out of focus. This one was obviously the Bach one, shot through a window that might have been fogged from the rain. So they, early on, established a look, and that helped the label very much, in that very quickly people started recognizing, oh, wait a minute, that looks like a similar one to the album that we just bought, and they helped because they had a consistent look, and the look says quality and art. They helped establish what the label has come to mean in terms of its approach to music. Here are a couple of other of their covers, and it's the same kind of approach. If you take the label Blue Note, that was one of the first labels really to use typeface, to use an approach to photography that was very modern, very often close-ups, which wasn't the tendency before that, and to use bright colors and sometimes a strip of a photograph like this one here of Lee Morgan and the Coltrane on the left. So they were one of the first ones to kind of take a very modern approach. And of course, jazz in the 50s, when they were making these covers in the 60s, this was the pinnacle of a modern musical movement. So the covers were communicating what was happening in the records and in the jazz scene at the time. My own label that I ran for many years called Hemisphere in EMI, I also decided in the beginning, because this was one of the earliest world music labels in a major company, I decided that it would be to my advantage to try to establish the label the way ECM did, by creating a look that people could recognize. So hopefully, my hope was, if they like the album, when the second album they buy and they realize this is a series, they will recognize the new ones as being part of the same family, and maybe I've gained trust. So the idea of having a label look really helped me communicate a label identity. The only danger is it sometimes ropes you into a corner, in that what you end up doing is, in a sense, elevating the label at the expense of the artist. So I found it was good to have a label look for compilations, but when it came time to release individual artists, if my emphasis was on the label, in a way, the identity of the artist was suffering and it was weakened a little bit. So I ended up adapting it and only using this framework at the top for the compilations and then changing it. The Putumayo label, I'm wondering if they feel like they may have backed themselves in a corner at this point. Because they were one of the best marketed labels, certainly in what we call the world music scene, in that they so quickly established a brand that was recognizable, as I've been saying with the other examples. And they were also getting into shops that nobody else was, like in museums and airports and everything else. And so that was a very successful idea to initially brand it. But I'm wondering it now, after they've had so many covers, if they feel like they've backed themselves into a corner. Because sometimes you can't remember, if you have a lot of them, you can't remember, do I have this album or not? Because there's a certain similarity. I'll have to ask them about that sometime. So here we've talked about the notion of storytelling, that you're using visuals to tell the story of what's happening in the music. And I'm suggesting that you should approach it with the same kind of creativity you approach your music. Now, what is this narrative we're talking about? It's very important as an artist to try to say who you are and what makes you unique. You don't want to rely on descriptions that people have already heard in other contexts. Because in the end, it's only if you're unique that you, in a sense, deserve an audience, because you're offering something that nobody else can. So what does it mean to be unique? And how do you communicate it? Well, different stories are told for different markets. For your home market, there's a lot of information you don't need to give. Let's say here we are in the Czech Republic, and if we're talking about Central European music, you don't need to explain an awful lot about the traditions, the Moravian traditions, or wherever, or the Roma traditions in the neighboring Bulgaria, Romania, and the rest, because people have that context. So your domestic story to tell who you are as an artist doesn't need that information. It's going to be different. But if you're working on an international audience and you want to introduce your music, then you need to explain these kinds of things. And who you are, what culture you were raised in, what culture you're working with musically is a very important part of that story. It's part of your narrative. So you want to tell that story. You know, very often people like myself who work in the field, we get, hundreds, thousands of press releases. You want to avoid things like, this is the Jimi Hendrix of the violin, which was something I received recently. It's like, I don't want Jimi Hendrix of the violin. I want to know what you do, who you are. Or, you'll hear the Bob Marley of Borneo or something like that. You want to explain what's unique. But if you think about a lot of the artists who have been successful, let's take somebody like Fela Kuti from Nigeria. When you think of Fela, you think of the music. And you also think of the story of who he is, his opposition to the military dictatorships of the time, how he suffered for it, he was in jail, You know, his mother was killed during a police raid. I mean, some terrible things, and his politics had a very high price. But his politics, his commitment, his integrity was part of his storytelling. Or somebody like Cesaria Evora, who had a beautifully successful career from Cabo Verde. She's known as the barefoot diva, because sometimes you can take that story and distill it down to its absolute minimum. The barefoot diva was a perfect description of who she was as an artist, because it told you diva, the stature, the majesty, the tremendous respect, but barefoot gave you a context that this is not concert hall music. This is music, you know, from the people, from the earth. Or if you take, I mean, what are some of the names? The Fab Four for the Beatles, the Glimmer Twins, you know, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Mama Africa for Miriam Makeba. Mama Africa, again, you know, communicates all that stature. So these are the stories. So you use this in creating your visuals. You use this in writing your bio. Your bio shouldn't be 2 pages. It should be very brief, but it should give something that makes people understand and makes them curious and want to know more and communicate the story. So these days, through the internet, so much more can be done individually by artists. Artists no longer need record labels and publicists for some of the tasks. It's always good to have them, it's always good to use them, but there are a lot of things increasingly that an artist can do on his or her own. I mean, the internet is the greatest thing that ever happened to the dissemination of information. It's the worst thing that ever happened to income for recorded music, because it's destroyed it. But you can control this, and you should have a consistency in your story. Now, getting back to covers and cover images and photo shoots, I would say that in all these places where you can save money because you can do it yourself, one of the places you should consider spending money is in your photographs, in your photo shoot. And what you do is you don't just hire a photographer who will shoot your photo in whatever setting. You sit down with the photographer and you say, here's the music, here's what we're doing, here's who we are, here's our story. How do we create an image that tells that story? So it's not just, let's stand against a wall in a factory and rust and it's really picturesque. It's like, if our music is industrial, if our music feels aggressive, if it's urban, you know, decay, if it's urban alienation, if it's electronic, how do we translate that into images? Well, then maybe the factory photo would be appropriate. So it's a place where you have a dialogue and where you use creativity to try to translate. Let's take a look at a few press photos. Here's a group from Colombia called La 33, which, as you can see from the instrumentation in this photograph, trombones, brass, they are an extraordinarily exciting group on stage. This photo doesn't say that. This photo shows, you know, it's taken from a low angle, so there's something creative about it. It's all the musicians together. It's kind of the typical photo shoot when the group and the photographer and the art director haven't really given it thought. There's no translation taking place. Here's the same group in a second photo. It's better. It's closer focus. It's a nicer shot. But here too, it's not communicating the excitement. And yet, look at this third one from the same group. This is a brilliant photo. And they're leaping out of the frame here. And for the first time of the three, they're communicating excitement. I see in this photo what I've seen on stage in terms of just tremendous energy and an explosion of you know, talent and fun and animation. The Warsaw Village Band from Warsaw, obviously enough, they've been around for a long time. At the beginning of their career, here are 2 photographs I'm going to show which was part of how they presented themselves. So who were they? They were young musicians, very contemporary, who were playing on largely traditional instruments, traditional music, but they were playing it in a very modern way. So how do you communicate the tradition, the instrumentation, but also something modern? I think they did a really good job in this first photograph. Here they are in a country setting. They've got the instrumentation, but also the sunglasses, the one guy with dreadlocks. You see attitude. You see kind of an approach. You see, you know, it looks cool. It doesn't look like sterile folk musicians. And then they did the exact opposite. Here they are in a country setting, but they're looking very contemporary. So here they are in a city setting on top of a building with the traditional instruments. Some of them are wearing slightly more rural kind of clothing in the dress. But once again, it's saying the same thing even though the environment is completely different. So they took a really creative approach. I want you to look at this picture. It's a group called Slavic Soul Party. And it's insane what they did in this photograph. And they are actually hanging from cables. I see everything that I know this group to be, having seen them live. It's tremendous joy and fun. It's very dynamic. But think about this. They spent a lot of money on this photo, and they're an independent group. They release on a small label, so they don't have big budgets. But they decided this was a place to spend money. Now you tell me, if you are running a festival and you need an image for the poster, are you going to do that image of the group standing on the street, you know, looking into the camera, smiling, going like this or whatever? Or are you going to use an image like this? What has happened, and I've asked them about this, is I said, how many times has this been the photograph that was published in an article about the 30 groups? And how many times has this been the program guide cover? And how many times has it been the poster? And they showed me a stack. So that was really smart, because that was free publicity. They had 30 groups to choose from. Of course you're going to choose this image. And here are some other ones. This group called Matuto did something quite amusing, because here again we see traditional musicians, but they're holding it up against their faces. And they said they did this for two reasons. One reason was they thought it would just be a great image, and the other was that the group personnel kept changing. And they didn't want to have to shoot a new photo every time the faces changed, so they actually don't have to now that they stood it up. So it was a creative solution, but it was also a really striking image that, again, you would publish this in an article about an upcoming festival. Hazmat Modin, another group. It's a beautiful photo. It's well lit, it's done in a studio. It communicates something about the group. And it's a really successful one as well. So you got to also be careful about the images you choose, because you can end up getting stuck with the look. So here are a couple that maybe you would want to avoid. So we've talked so far about developing this story, this narrative, finding a way to communicate who you are in a narrative way that makes it appealing. What I've found to be very interesting as a person who's written a lot of press releases is the degree to which you can determine how the music will be talked about in the press, and then on radio, and then in the general public. One of the things that's really impressed me over the years, because I've written hundreds and hundreds of press releases, is the degree to which you, the press release writer, can determine how you will be viewed. You can create the context that suddenly is the way it's talked about in the press, on the radio, in general in the public. You have a tremendous degree of control and influence. And this is, again, the part of that storytelling and the narrative. So if your story is consistent and you use it in your interviews, in your bio, in your visuals, in your briefing to your photographer, you should also be carrying this forward in all the materials you're going to create. So let's take press kits. You want to follow through with the storytelling and use the same aesthetic throughout. Here's an example of a press release from Blue Note Records. So Blue Note, one of the great prestigious jazz records, major label, works with it. So Blue Note, a major jazz label. It's been around for over 50 years. Here's one of their press releases, which, from an information standpoint, does everything you want a press release to do. It's got a photo, it tells you when the album's coming out, it's got a bio, has the full track listing, the US tour dates, who you need to contact for more information. But of course, visually, it's completely dead and static. Here's a press release from a group called the Strokes, which essentially does the same thing as the Blue Note one, but visually it's just richer. So here, it's telling you release dates, tour dates, track listing, who to contact, and all the rest. But they have a look from the group, and it's a black and white photo, so it's black background and white text. It does the same thing, but it does it with interest. A journalist, a radio person, a festival programmer is going to receive hundreds of these, sometimes thousands in a year, because everybody wants the few opportunities that they're on. So, which one is going to grab somebody's attention? Okay, if it's a sheet of paper and you're only getting one, you'll see it. If you've got 100 of these on your desk, which one is going to call you to look at first? Obviously, the Strokes. And online press kits are another great tool, thanks to the internet. And these two should use some kind of nice graphic design. I mean, what you can do, of course, you can link to videos, you can link to music, you can have links to downloading PDFs with your tour rider, with your press photos, all of these things. So take advantage, but carry forward the visual that you've created in the album, in your story and in how you've told your story. Here's a group from Poland, Włosi. And I think they did this small, it was about a little smaller than a CD size, a 4-page brochure to introduce themselves, because this is when they were new. First page, white, black print, very striking. But this is a group that has a great story. And the first time I met Christoph, the group leader, he told me the story and I was immediately interested. He and his brother are classically trained musicians. He's a violinist, his brother's a cellist. His brother was getting married in the south of Poland, and they decided they wanted to hire some village musicians to play at the wedding. So these two, a bass player, a viola player, and a violin player, came to play village music. And great wedding, and they all were, drinking and having a good time. By the end of the wedding, they decided just to jam together. And they really had a good time. But they had no intention to create a group. But then they found, over the course of the years, because they had their family vacation house down in the region, when they would be down there, they'd meet up with them again and they'd play and they'd go to a local bar and just enjoy themselves. And over a course of about 1 or 2 years, it developed organically. So this is not one of those kind of like intellectual exercises where a classical musician says, I want to get back to the roots of the culture and I want to, there was nothing intellectual and planned about it. It happened entirely organically and naturally. And when you see them, they are exciting on stage because the musicianship is stunning, but also they're very dynamic and they're having a wonderful time. How do you communicate that visually? Here's the factory. The abandoned factory photo, where you've got a long shot, group, beautiful lighting. And so this is an image that's saying something about the group. They're saying there's something contemporary, this is not concert hall music, it's in a factory. But also, they're all standing dynamically, and they're not stayed, and it's beautifully lit, it's very dramatic. So there's a quality in the photo that leads you to believe there may be quality in the music. They had minimal text. There's a temptation when you're doing press material or promotional material to say everything that there is to say about the group. It's much better to distill it down to what is the minimum you can say, so there's a chance people will actually read it, but that actually communicates. And they did that beautifully on this page. 4 paragraphs, set up graphically very cleanly, in bold. They say we play as if it was the last day of our lives. that is really good. That, once again, is communicating the passion, the intensity. They call us a string quintet of astonishing virtuosity. And then there's the text. We did not stop there, more text. Really simple and clear. They didn't need to tell their creation story. They didn't need to say their philosophy, how they mix this with that, and take classical and harmonic structure and add it to certain village traditions. They didn't need to. They realized that in this case, less is more. And then the final page shows a thrilling image. You know, the hair is flying, it's framed in a very modern way, it's on stage, and you see the excitement, and it's got the contact information. So I think that's a perfect example of how to visualize something that comes from a different medium. And finally, we come to the notion of websites. And once again, you're dealing with a different medium that has a different potential. Once again, you should think about translation. How do you translate what you have to say about your music and your visuals into a website? Now, here's an example of a website that I think is really well done, offers a lot of information. It's not necessarily thrilling graphically, and they certainly didn't take advantage of what the medium might be able to do. So I would call this an excellent example of kind of a standard way of going about it. And you'll notice, first up, you know, the top heading is the tour agency, the artist agents, nice photo. There's a link to a video right there, or a SoundCloud track. On the right-hand column, it's got links for tour dates for the artist's own website, their record label. And then it has some downloads, the tour rider. And for those of you who are not in the music business, it's the things that the artists need on stage, the number of microphones, the setup, the conditions, the kind of instruments they may need to have rented. It's got a news link, and this would be scrolling down. The next thing it's got are very short reviews from people who are well respected. They've got Willie Nelson, well-known country music artist, well respected, who says, you know, just a fantastic group, I was overwhelmed. It's far better to have somebody else say this stuff than you yourself in your bio. You know, for you to say we're a thrilling group and we go new places that nobody's gone before musically, and we've entered all these, you know, elements, and fine, you know, you're raving about yourself, but it doesn't have credibility. It has credibility if somebody, this is in the US, NPR is National Public Radio, the most respected public radio source in the United States. And it's got Willie Nelson, and it's got, you know, newspapers that everybody knows. So far better to do that. And notice they haven't even told their bio yet. First they started with an image and with some music, and then the reviews, and then they get into the details and links to videos. So I think that's a good example of getting the information across. But I was talking yesterday to an artist who does performance work, and she had kind of the standard website, and I was saying to her, if you do modern performance, very contemporary electronic music, how can you translate that into a website experience? Think of it as a new medium that you can explore and experiment with. You know, put in GIFs, put in loops, put in, you know, really modern kind of elements and slideshows, so that the music, the site, is doing something like what you do on stage. And again, Bjork is a good example of an artist who does exactly that. She translates uniquely into every different medium. And so the last thing I want to mention is the follow-up. We've created a story. We've used that story to inform how the visuals are going to be created, and hopefully carrying through, making the translation. We've shown how that can be used in photo shoots, in press photos, in covers, in ads, in websites. In terms of promotion, getting off the subject just a little, I went to a concert recently in Reunion Island, and I was sitting there and I was watching this group, and I was thinking, this is not the kind of thing I work with, but I know people who would really like this. you know, and I got to tell them about it. But needless to say, very often you have that impulse and you're sincere and you never follow it up and you never tell the people you meant to because, you know, you got distracted and other things happened. When I got back to the hotel that night after the showcase, this is what the artist manager has sent. And he should have done it in English and French. He did it only in French, but the audience was both. But I got back to the hotel and he had already gotten the mailing list, the email addresses of everybody who was attending, which is an easy thing to get when you go to a conference or a showcase event. He had already put it in his computer. We get back to the hotel, and this was waiting in my email. And it had links to the group, it had photos, it had descriptions, it had reviews. I immediately forwarded it to the people I was thinking of. And I probably would have forgotten to do that otherwise. And he uses the imagery of the group as well. So never forget the importance of the follow-up, and the follow-up should include the story, should include the visuals. So you can see what we've been talking about here is a creative process. And it should be approached creatively with the same kind of energy and inventiveness that you approach everything else that you do musically. Your imagery, your story needs to be as exciting as your music. If it's not, you've not only lost an opportunity, but you may even have hurt yourself a little bit. You know, I've received press material where you've got the group standing there and you know, and it's the usual text. And it's just, you know, it's boring, it's dull. It doesn't tell me anything about this group. Why miss an opportunity? Be creative, tell your story, develop a narrative, and be consistent.